This is episode 12 of season 5 of Babylon 5, The Ragged Edge. Sheridan is merrily trying to sign multiple copies of a treaty as Delenn pushes him on time. He acknowledges he's late, somewhat distractedly, and asks Delenn to stall. She says fine, she'll take a vote on attacking Earth. He keeps signing, then pauses, having processed, looking puzzled. He dashes to the council chamber only to find them empty, save for Delenn, who tells him the others have decided to attend no further meetings until the ISA can guarantee their ship's safety. The problem is the attacks are happening in the space between territories, meaning local navies won't get involved there, so it's just down to the ISA. Both acknowledge they need a break to at least be able to identify who the aggressors are. The scene then switches to Red Star 9, an Earth freighter protected by Drazi Sunhawks taking heavy fire whilst its comms are jammed. One crew member manages to eject as the assailants jump out, having eliminated the escorts and the freighter. G'Kar and Londo return to the station, Londo pondering why he is happier to be back there than he is on arriving to Centauri Prime, when it used to be the other way round. G'Kar suggests he's just not supposed to be happy anywhere. Londo notices G'Kar is attracting a lot of attention from his fellow Narn, despite not having been away that long. G'Kar is puzzled by this, but Londo sees an opportunity to profit by having people pay G'Kar to stay away for even longer periods. An exasperated G'Kar follows him on. Garibaldi is late up, and Zack notes he looks like hell, the reason being his consumption of a bottle of the strong stuff. Nevertheless, he covers his tracks by suggesting he's coming down with a cold and agrees to join a meeting in a half hour. The Rangers have identified that the escape pod survived the attack on the Drazi. Any survivors are, however, likely to be smugglers because they're from a human freighter. The member races are using them to bring in items on the ISA's prohibited list on the quiet. Garibaldi has a contact on the Drazi homeworld from his time on Europa, who might be able to help. Sheridan suggests taking Franklin as backup, but Garibaldi declines, saying his contact will only talk to him so he'd be wasting his time. Sheridan and Delenn give him the nod to be on a Drazi transport in an hour. G'Kar finds a massive Narn outside his quarters, and at the end of the line, Talon. It seems that as he has been gone for a while, the Kari took it upon themselves to liberate the Book of G'Kar from his quarters for safekeeping, as it was the only copy. Was being the operative word, as it turns out, as Talon guesses that between the copies of copies and its printing run, there are now hundreds of thousands of copies in the wild. He congratulates G'Kar on becoming a religious icon as G'Kar closes his eyes. Garibaldi hands over duties to Zack as he heads to his transport, and Franklin also catches up with him on the way out, quizzing him on the manner in which he declined his help. They've known each other long enough for him to know when something's not sitting right, but he doesn't really have anything to go on, so he has to take Garibaldi's reassurance at face value. We then get a nice departure sequence on a Drazi atmosphere-capable transport. Meanwhile, G'Kar had gathered a small following to Londo's amusement, and had also heard about the Book of G'Kar. G'Kar notes that the next council meeting has been postponed, and Londo suggests G'Kar speak to Delenn, but they're hopeful for a lead. We switch to Garibaldi's ride, exiting hyperspace and landing on the Drazi homeworld, which we've never seen before. The atmospherics give off a yellowish colouring to everything, as Garibaldi settles into his hotel room before quickly drawing his PPG on a new arrival, his contact Tafik. They rapidly reconcile and exchange pleasantries, Garibaldi wondering why the streets are so narrow, and Tafik explaining the Drazi used to guard against invasion by making it hard for invaders to get into the cities in large numbers. Garibaldi points out that there are these things called bombs these days, but Tafik says that just as human traditions stick past their time, so do Drazi ones. On a more professional level, Garibaldi's pilot is here, and very keen to get off the planet as quickly as possible, as he is not Flavour of the Month with his employers for having lost their ship. So a meeting is arranged for later as Tafik and Garibaldi share a drink, and Tafik asks what happened to his hair. Just as Franklin is trying to eat, Earth Dome has an urgent call for him, so he has to head to his quarters. On the Drazi homeworld, the old friends have polished off the bottle, and Tafik leaves to sort out the travel arrangements back to B5, but is gunned down outside the hotel room by someone who knows who he is. Garibaldi stirs on the balcony and calls his friend's name. Just then he's pinpointed with a laser sight, but recalls Tafik telling him the pilot would have a precision pointer and the location of the balcony. However, on exiting his room, he's confronted by Tafik's Drazi attacker, and after a fist fight manages to hurl him off his balcony before being spotted by a flyer. Running back to Tafik, he knows he's finished, and encourages him to get to the pilot before the Drazi do. Unfortunately, it's too late. Garibaldi flies into a group of 3 assailants, but given his earlier fight and state of inebriation, he's quickly brought down. He checks the pilot after the hooded assailants leave, but he's gone, and Garibaldi makes himself scarce before the Drazi, who seem to go off the balcony, arrives, having hauled himself back up. He then calls to Lenin for a White Star to get him off the planet, as his details are everywhere. She'll call him White Star 26 for a dust-off. Jakar has holed himself up in his quarters as his followers continue to gather. Talon is allowed to come in again. He suggests that those waiting would like to speak to him, but Jakar notes he turned down the opportunity to lead their world because it was not his place. This is no different. Talon goes on to remind him that he once had told him he had an advantage in arms over him. Once his blade is unsheathed, he has an obligation to use it. Does Jakar not share that obligation? He says he has not read his book, but he has seen the eyes of those who have read it opening. Their leaders only understand what they have had to learn for 100 years, fighting and hate. Talon believes that with everything he has seen, Jakar can teach by helping his people simply to unlearn hatred and fear. Jakar, however, is concerned that if he takes this responsibility on, having always sought to be solely responsible for what he does, the speaker might overcome the message. Talon assures him that if that ever becomes a risk, he will simply kill him. As a warrior, this is what he can do. He says he will accept his burden as he bloodies his blade on his own hand in order to sheathe it, if Jakar will accept his. And with that, Jakar invites the acolytes into his quarters. A battered Garibaldi is reporting back to Sheridan, Delenn and Jakar. He tries to explain away why he didn't hear his friend getting jumped as post-journey fatigue, then goes on to deduce that the cloaked assailants weren't Drazi, they were easier to punch. Also, they weren't affiliated to the police because they ran. So whoever they were something different. All he has is a small item he took from one of them in the course of the fight. Just then, Londo joins them after a hold-up in a transport tube. They catch him up until he spots what Garibaldi is holding and identifies it as a button from the Centauri Royal Guard, as it has a very particular emblem on it. Garibaldi then says he bought it on the Zocalo, thinking it was worth something, at which Londo chuckles and tells him he was taken for a ride. The others rapidly see what Garibaldi is doing, and Sheridan moves on to the next item on the agenda. Shortly afterwards, they reconvene in private without Londo, realising that he wouldn't have told them about the button if he knew the implications, but at the same time knowing that he could have accidentally leaked the information about the operation to others without knowing their intentions. Garibaldi wonders whether they should bring Londo in, but Jakar then relates their encounter with a third-party force in the Centauri Royal Court, and notes that the wrong question from Londo could result in a very swift death, because he is alive only because the side in the Royal Court wants it that way. While that side remains undetermined, his involvement is likely to result in his death. So for now they have to keep him out of the loop despite what they have suggesting Centauri involvement. Sheridan asks Jakar to keep an eye on Londo when he goes back to Centauri Prime, Jakar quipping that these days an eye is all he has. In Franklin's office, he records a puzzling log entry that suggests he's had to make a difficult decision and is going to be leaving the station. In the sanctuary, Jakar has begun his teaching to broaden his people's horizons. It turns out the Book of Jakar is itself a slight barrier to doing so, so he encourages a student to put his face in the book, then slams it shut on his head. As Talon wryly observes, here endeth the first lesson. Franklin goes to see Sheridan. Dr. Benjamin Kyle from Earthdome has been in touch with him. We last saw him way back in the gathering when he was initially in Franklin's position. He's since become the head of xenobiological research for Earthdome, but is retiring at the end of the year, and Franklin has been offered his role. He tries to sell it as a plus to the ISA because he'll have far better facilities to assist with the work on interspecies disease transmission, but it will mean that at the end of the year he would leave the station and the friends he's made there. Sheridan seems almost angry at first, but is probably just floored by the sudden announcement initially, and is sorry to be losing both his expertise and his presence as a friend, even if not right away. They shake hands, Franklin saying he'll tell Delenn himself, and has a call into Garibaldi, who is again sleeping off a bottle of the strong stuff. He figures he'll take it hardest as known him the longest of those who remain on the station. Well, we said goodbye to the Queen earlier. Now we're saying goodbye to Franklin, it seems. As I've noted earlier this season, his roles seem to be increasingly sporadic for some reason, as if he was falling between his Earth Alliance role and his ISA role. Whilst he isn't leaving immediately, we can imagine he'd be winding down towards the end of the year, and as he notes, he's one of the longest standing members of the original crew. It's an interesting decision to make, but of course JMS knows where the show is going to land for the start of 2263, and so this is just a part of the process for him. This does of course mean that you have to start wondering just who else might get slated to move into a different role or a different location as the season progresses, and how that might come about. We've already lost Ivanova abruptly. Speaking of which, it's interesting Franklin doesn't tell Lockley about his decision, or at least there's no mention of him doing so. From an Earth Force perspective, you think he'd need to get a green light from his CO first before anything else, because she's got to backfill his position. But hey, what would I know? Sheridan's reaction to his decision seemed a little off to me somehow, but then it's not like it's just a colleague leaving for a better posting. It must be personally painful when they've been through quite so much together as a whole. So perhaps it felt a little like a betrayal at first before the professionalism kicked in, I don't know. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that one. So, Garibaldi on the Drazi homeworld is a bolt from the blue, and one that highlights both what he can bring to his role and just how much his alcoholism could cost those who should be able to rely on him. Twice in this episode, he effectively has to trade on goodwill to cover up some shortcomings. At the same time, it's also a very effective demonstration of how the use of CGI and relatively limited settings, correctly accounted for in dialogue, could be used to rapidly set up a completely new alien planet we've never been to before in just a few minutes. You can see that these days it would be a complete doddle, relatively speaking, to reproduce this sort of concept, especially with advanced planning. So if the reboot happens, you could happily anticipate a lot more planet hopping being brought into the mix. In fairness, we have seen Narn, Centauri Prime and Minbar amongst others before now, but there just seems a little more variety to the shots here. Maybe because it's a new setting, it just felt more interesting? I don't know. I thought it was quite funny when the Drazi Garibaldi seemed to have flipped over the balcony, then clawed his way back up, having presumably landed on the balcony below, unless the Drazi have some flying capability we're not aware of. I thought it was a bit odd that despite being caught in the flyer's spotlight, Garibaldi didn't immediately get swamped by Drazi police officers, but hey. He was also supposed to be meeting the pilot in a park area, but instead finds him on the street. Maybe because the Centauri agents moved him there, in fairness. There's a nice bit of character interaction with Garibaldi and Tafik, and I guess that was intended to make it clear that Garibaldi should feel like a schmuck for drinking too much with him. He was going out of his way to help Garibaldi after all, and I'm sure his character being built up was also to make us assume he was actually going to make it. Nope, because JMS clearly had a point to make, so that was the end of him. The interaction between G'Kar and Talon has always been interesting. Talon is a very straightforward speaker who we haven't seen since Season 3, and even then he wasn't afraid to call G'Kar out. This is very similar, again pointing out that as much as he likes his sword, G'Kar has other weapons at his disposal with which to help their people. What's also telling is that he has no need to read the Book of G'Kar in order to want to support him. He has always instinctively supported him, and now is no different. It's unclear whether this new path might ultimately take G'Kar, because as he says to Talon, he's never wanted to take responsibility for any actions other than his own. So he's really caught in a web of his own making, somewhat unintentionally as it turns out. I should also note here that the odds of a white star breezing into Drazi space, particularly the homeworld, landing on the surface and then breezing back out again seems somewhat short. We get glimpses of Drazi orbital installations as Garibaldi's transport comes in, and their Sunhawks are generally established to be quite capable warships that are likely to fire first and ask questions later. So I guess we'll have to give the captain and perhaps the Minbari stealth tech the benefit of the doubt here. I think more than anything it was there to underline just how badly Garibaldi had messed up. For the first time in many episodes, we also get absolutely zero mention of Byron. This is hardly surprising given the events of the previous episode, and yet the implication was that Leeta was going to be carrying on his work, so It might have been interesting to see her in the background briefly at some point this episode, given how long that plotline has already run this season. That being said, the counter-argument for that is probably equally valid in that we might have had too much of that plotline this season, so it's about time the ISA got some more of the spotlight. This is part of the balancing act the show now finds itself with, given that the ISA had perhaps been introduced earlier than would have been the case with Season 4 having been compacted. The show is about the space station, not the ISA, yet the space station has birthed the ISA. The two are very much in each other's orbit, but as Garibaldi going off station demonstrates, the show has never actually limited itself purely to the station as a locale. It's just that now we've rather zoomed out from it, as compared with the first season where we very rarely left it. This, of course, is evolution. Before I go, I will just note that the main Babylon 5 reboot seems to be hanging in the balance a little, and you should check JMS on Twitter to read about that as a concept. Also, aside from that full series reboot, there is also a legacy project involving the surviving cast members from this iteration of the show that is ready to go for next year. JMS has given no clue as to the nature of said project, other than saying it includes everyone and is done. That's it. If I knew more, I would say, "Do not know, so cannot say." Much apologizing. Until next time.